Re-
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Our webinar will start momentarily at 2 p.m. All right, welcome everyone. It is 2 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're excited to have you join us today for economic justice for survivors of intimate partner violence. So just a few things before we get started. So some housekeeping things. If you're having difficulty listening or hearing, please try to check your settings. If not, if it still continues, please jump off and on, log back on and log back off and on. If you need technical assistance throughout this presentation, please feel free to private message continuing education and we'll try to help you out as much as we can. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature today. We want to answer any and all of your questions, so please put your questions in the Q&A box. And any recordings and slides will be posted in a few weeks on our website. So if you purchase continuing education credits in your account, the way you access your webinar, you'll be able to access your evaluation and your certificate if you purchased CEs for today. We also want to acknowledge a few programs around the nation. First, Rutgers School of Social Work, the Violence Against Women's Research Consortium, and University of Maryland School of Social Work, Office of Continuing Professional Education, as well as the National Institute of Justice, NIA. This virtual brown bag is supported and part of award number 2016 MU-CX K011, awarded by the National Institute of Justice. A disclaimer: the opinions and points of views expressed in this presentation are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. And for today's moderator, we have Dr. Rachel Voth-Frog, Assistant Professor at the University of Texas at Arlington School of Social Work. She is her research focuses on community-based survivor-centered services for survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual violence. She previously worked in economic education and advocacy with survivors at Redevelopment Opportunities for Women, Inc. in St. Louis. She also holds an MSW and PhD from Washington University in St. Louis and has been working in the field of gender-based violence intervention and prevention for 17 years. So Dr. Voth-Frog, please.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this webinar focused on economic justice for survivors of intimate partner violence, presented by the NIJ, the Violence Against Women's Research Consortium, which is a collaborative of the Center for Research on Ending Violence at Rutgers and the University of Maryland School of Social Work. The focus of the consortium is to identify gaps in research and practice in the areas of intimate partner violence, sexual violence, stalking, and teen dating violence, and to implement research and evaluation projects to fill gaps in our current knowledge in this field. The final goal is to disseminate research to a wide range of audiences, and is the reason that we are together this afternoon to talk about economic justice for survivors. This webinar is one of several being hosted during Domestic Violence Awareness Month and aims to share important information to promote economic justice and security for survivors of intimate partner violence, their families, and their communities. Some of the objectives of our webinar today are to promote an understanding of the intersection of IPV and economic justice, to further an understanding of the interconnection between intimate partner violence and homelessness, and to report on survivors' experiences of economic hardship during the COVID-19 pandemic. To this end, I'm very happy to welcome our first presenter, Kim Pentico. Kim Pentico is the Economic Justice Director at the National Network to End Domestic Violence, or NNEDV. She has been working with and on behalf of survivors of sexual and domestic violence since 1990. She spent over 7 years working for a local domestic violence program in Kansas, and another 7 years at the Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. She has also worked for the STOP Technical Assistance Project in Washington, D.C. Kim works to ensure and enhance survivor access to economic justice and long-term safety. Thank you for being with us, Kim.
Thanks so much for that great introduction. I appreciate it. And thanks so much for everybody who took time out of their day to join for today. I really do appreciate that. So I work for the National Network. We are a network of the 56 US and state domestic violence territories across the country. There is one federally recognized domestic violence coalition in every state and territory. And so we represent them. We both work on public policy level with members of Congress, as well as do training and technical assistance, which is the side that I work on. And so I suspect that as many of you are practitioners and are working in the field on some level, there's not going to be any huge aha moments for you today, but I think that maybe just confirming some things you suspected and also connecting some dots as I think the day will go on. So I don't want to assume that you don't already know all these things, but we know that 1 in 3 women in particular will experience some sort of domestic violence or IPV in their adult lives, versus we know, as you all know, a much higher rate of IPV for women who are living in poverty, anywhere from 8 to 33% recent or current violence, and additionally a much higher prevalence of also childhood physical and sexual violence. So, and I'm sure, again, this is not anything that's news to you all, is that why is that? Well, we know that having limited financial resources is a big risk factor to domestic violence, which makes sense. Fewer resources equals fewer good choices for getting and or staying safe, which completely makes sense. You know, if I consider myself pretty middle income, and if my home becomes unsafe to me tonight because of people who are living in it, I have the ability to get into a gassed up car. I can travel across town. I can reserve a hotel room for several days that I feel fairly safe in. And or I can tap into my family resources. I can go to my mother's house. And as you all know, oftentimes socioeconomic status travels through generations and is passed on generationally. And so statistically speaking, she's also middle or upper income, and I could tap into her resources to increase and improve my safety. Versus if I'm living in poverty, leaving looks very different. I may be getting into an unreliable vehicle or relying on public transportation. I may be having to get a hotel room that doesn't feel particularly safe, or doubling up with friends or family members who, statistically speaking, are in a similar socioeconomic status as myself. So that would probably look like doubling up on a couch with my kids in a living room, or even sleeping in my car for a couple of nights with my kids. And so then when my partner calls me and begs me to come home and tells me how sorry they are, that negotiation looks very different. If I am trying to stay safe in my car and stay warm, and I know I've got to send my kids to school tomorrow with no lunch money and they had not showered, and what does that look like? So that negotiation looks different. And I'm not able to navigate and negotiate my safety in the same way when finances are a piece of that negotiation. And we also know that the abuser is able to gain more control due to the increased vulnerability that poverty causes. If my harm doer knows that I've got the baby with me and I'm running out of diapers, then that my harm doer is able to say, I bought diapers, just come get the diapers. I'll give you the diapers. I'm so sorry about all of this. I just want to make it up for you. I just want to do right by my family and all those things. That negotiation and my lack of access to my own resources increases my vulnerability that my harm doer has to myself and my kids. We also know that the abuse is likely to last longer and result in more severe injuries for those who are living in poverty, which again makes sense. If I'm not able to navigate financially my way out of the situation, then I have to stay there longer, and I'm likely to have more severe injuries due to the domestic violence. So again, as you all know, this does not mean that those living in poverty are more violent, and it certainly does not mean that those living with plenty of financial resources are not experiencing or at risk of experiencing abuse. We simply know that poverty is an additional risk factor to my safety when domestic violence is a part of that. So when we talk about what is financial abuse, it's not domestic violence and financial abuse. Financial abuse is actually a form of domestic violence. As you know, what's at the center of domestic violence is power and control. It is a pattern of coercive behavior used to gain and maintain power and control within that relationship. It is one of many very effective tactics to keep survivors tied into those relationships and to keep them trapped in those relationships, just along the same lines as intimidation and coercion and use of kids. Financial abuse and economic abuse is one of those many tactics that holds that power and control into place. And when we see some of those tactics not working as well as they have in the past, then that's when we see physical and sexual violence employed to kind of hold it all together. And we know that, like many of the other tactics, but particularly with financial abuse, it often traps the survivor in that relationship for many of the reasons we just talked about. And we know that survivors report, as much as 99% of survivors report experiencing some form of financial abuse. So we also know that the tactics themselves, the abusers' tactics themselves, can also plummet survivors into poverty, which makes sense. If I'm always tapping into my financial resources to get and stay safe, I may start out middle income, but if I'm losing jobs because my abuser shows up, or I am having to get medical help or hire an attorney, or just miss work all the time, then I may now be in lower socioeconomic status than when it started. So the domestic violence itself can actually plummet me into living in poverty. So let's look at some of the tactics we hear survivors report to us. This is not comprehensive by any means, but harassing at workplace, so that I lose my job potentially. So calling all the time, showing up. Maybe they're my childcare provider and they drank my harm doer drank all night, so I can't feel good about leaving my kids home alone with them. Or they've sabotaged my way to work by disabling the car, or taken my bus voucher so I can't get there easily. So I end up maybe even losing my job. Identity theft, or even ruining credit. So saying they're going to pay bills that they don't pay, or taking out lines of credit that I don't know about under my name so that I'm not able to get a new smartphone, or I'm not able to rent a new apartment, or those kinds of things. Causing an eviction is a huge piece of that. There is a place where landlords often will tap into to see if you've been evicted from places. And if I've had to call law enforcement multiple times, or there's been damage done to a property unit, I may not be able to get a new apartment on my own. So I really, truly, literally am trapped. We also hear from survivors that their harm doer forces them to commit illegal activity, commit crimes. Again, also decreasing their ability to possibly get a job, housing, and or in some cases, post-secondary education funding if they have a felony conviction, continuing to further trap that survivor in that relationship. But we hear from survivors all the time, I knew if I got him high for the night, he'd leave me alone. And so if she gets caught doing that, oftentimes, then that just exacerbates that. I highly recommend, if anybody has a chance to read Beth Ritchie's book called Compelled to Crime. It's a fantastic look at how so many female prisoners are there in large part due to domestic violence or intimate partner violence, as well as sabotaging success at getting more education or looking professional for work or interviews. So keeping somebody up all night, blackening their eyes so they don't show up to work, and those kinds of things really are very effective at keeping survivors trapped in those relationships. But it's important to note that, and again, probably things that you all very well know, is that leaving does not necessarily equal safety. It is counterintuitive, right? You know, you're being hurt at home, leave home, leave that person that's your harm doer. But what we know that this is oftentimes an impossible situation for survivors. Leaving is one of the most dangerous times for survivors. Their risk at dying at the hands of their harm doer increases by 7 times when they make an act of independence, like attempting to leave, like getting a job, trying to go to school, telling a neighbor, those kinds of things, because that power and control, when they make an act of independence, that's challenging that power and control. So that's when we see physical and sexual violence being employed to try to keep it all together. And so it's a really dangerous time for survivors. I think it's 2 out of, or at least half of every domestic homicides committed, you can find that there was some sort of history of a protection order filed or some sort of protection act taken. So it's often a very dangerous time for survivors. And we also know that if not already again living in poverty, that it may actually result in living in poverty. We also often hear from survivors that when their harm doer is close to them, they feel like they can navigate their safety better, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but there's a fire-breathing dragon in the room. The safest place to be sometimes is as close to that dragon as possible. And we hear survivors tell us all the time is, I didn't know his next move when he wasn't here. At least I could judge his mood, at least I could judge my safety potentially when they were close by. So it's just something to think about. And yet, so we know this, we know all of this intuitively, and we know it also by the practices that we do and the people that we see. How does economic justice and financial empowerment measure up in the work that we're doing on a daily basis, either as practitioners, as advocates, as folks in law enforcement? Why isn't it a bigger part of the work that we're doing? If we know that 99% of all survivors are experiencing some form of financial abuse, why is that not where all of our energy is at? Is just getting access to flexible funding. And we're finding out that people don't always have the information and skills they need to be successful in this area, whether that be the survivors themselves, but also the advocates that are helping on the front line don't often feel like they have the information they need. And then in turn, then services are not truly reflective of that need. Services tend to be really focused on things beyond the financial piece of it, that are not necessarily connected to the finances, which is really what survivors have been telling us for years is, I just need access to cash. I just need access to housing. And they're not able to get that. And so they're very trapped in those relationships. So we also know that advocates often don't feel confident in their own skills and abilities in talking about money and finances. They themselves are struggling financially. I hate to tell you, but we're some of the poorest paid people out there, right? Because this is how we value things, right? And so you have advocates struggling to make their own car payments and struggling to make their own rent payments. And so they don't feel qualified to talk about budgeting and those kinds of things with survivors. So they're struggling themselves. And then they're just simply overworked and underpaid as well. So finding the time is a huge challenge. So we're working really hard on the economic justice team to incorporate economic justice into everyday advocacy work. We're encouraging folks to put in their screening when folks come into services. We're making it just a core part of the work that they do. We're so excited to see lots of funding resources really address this now. It's in OVW, it's in the FIPSA, it's in VOCA, it's in CDC's doing work on this. So I think folks are starting to finally pay attention that money, I think we used to think that access to money and resources was this nice icing on the cake, but we're really finding that it's actually a core of safety. I can't afford safety sometimes. I can't afford to not be beaten at times. And so I have to have access to funds to get safe. So also just creating an environment where you can have honest conversation and dialogue about money, and then really helping folks celebrate successes that they're having at the local program level. We're doing this through what we're trying to do is innovative programming and grant making by supporting both IDAs and non-traditional match savings programs. We're supporting education and job training through compassionate assistance, meaning if somebody needs to have their car fixed, we just pay to have their car fixed. Just low and no barrier access to cash. And we just trust survivors. We trust them as human beings to do what they need to do to get and keep their kids and their family safe. We're helping folks do credit repair and do microloans. And a big piece of the work that we do is with our partnership with the All State Foundation and the Moving Ahead Through Financial Literacy curriculum, which I'll just briefly tap onto just in case anybody's interested in it. It's free. It's available to anybody who wants to access it. It's a very traditional in lots of ways, 5-part module curriculum we talk about budgeting, credit and loans, long-term planning, but what sets it apart is module 1, which is all about safety planning within the context of domestic violence. So
Go
ahead.
3 minutes.
Oh, 3 minutes. Sorry, thanks. So how to do, how to take pictures of documents and what kind of documents you need to start paying attention to, where you store them, how you start creating a Go fund, those kinds of things. And then those things are woven throughout the rest of the curriculum. Well, what we've learned in doing this is that we've learned that everybody has a learning curve, including the advocates. We're not born knowing this. We're not always taught it. And for many, many, many of us, it comes with a lot of baggage, a lot of emotional baggage. Talking about money is hard. It's hard for all of us. And then we tie it into then all of the messages that survivors are given from their batter about their skills and abilities that come, around money and finances. It is fraught. And so we have learned that we have to go slow with survivors. We can't talk about budgeting on the first visit. We have to establish trust and credibility with survivors, and recognize that talking about money is hard, and it's just filled with lots of triggers for all of us, from families of origin to relationships to all of those things. So we're trying to do really thoughtful programming. We're focusing our funds on disparity reduction funds, just giving people access to cash, trusting people, valuing people and their needs, really focusing on making participation accessible, providing food, childcare, transportation, incentives. It's okay to give a $20 gift card every time somebody shows up. It's okay. And we don't have to track how they used it. We can just give it to them and it's okay. And we're concentrating on celebrating successes, and really focusing a lot on credit building. We were really fortunate a couple years ago to get some seed money. We've been able to get some continuation funds, but we have an independence project. This is available for any survivor of domestic violence can apply. They have to have met with the DV advocate at least 3 times, and the DV advocate has to confirm that, just because we've told our funders the funds are going to support survivors of domestic violence, and that's how we're confirming that. But they are eligible for a $100 no fee, no interest credit building loan. They pay back the loan $10 a month for 10 months. Every month she makes her payment, we report it to the 3 credit bureaus. And on average, we see credit scores increase by 35 and 40 points by the end of the 10-month period. These loans are fully backed, meaning that if for some reason the borrower is unable to complete their loan, we pay it off out of our guarantor fund and we just close it down. We don't put it into default status. We just pay it off out of our guarantor fund and close it. So we are looking to expand this. We eventually would like to be able to do some used car loans for survivors. We know it's a huge need in rural areas, and it's a huge direct connection with safety, access to transportation. And so that's one of the things we're working towards. So if anybody, has a big trust fund they'd like to figure out how to spend, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to help you figure that out. But that sort of sums it up for me. That's who I am. If you have any questions, I just also want to note that I think we all have a reason why we do this. This is my reason why. These are my kiddos. They are, goodness, this is McKenna and Maddox. This is when they were 3 and 5. This is when we went to Walt Disney World the first time. This is them now-ish. This is the day we dropped McKenna off at her freshman year of college. That's her little brother holding her. This is why I do this work, is I can't guarantee their safety, even though I do this work. And so I'm talking to you all because you're part of my safety net for them, whether you knew it or not. So for whatever reason, they need help and they reach out to you, I want you to remember that they're my kids. They're my McKenna and they're my Maddox. And if for whatever reason they couldn't come to me, they're coming to you. And everybody we serve is somebody else's McKenna and Maddox. And so on behalf of all the McKenna and Maddox moms out there, thanks for the work you do. And I'd be happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you so much for sharing and for that charge to all of us. I think we're going to have questions at the end, and I will make sure that those get passed on to you in the Q&A. And I'm very excited to now invite our next presenter. Andrea Hetling is a professor at the Edward J. Blaustein School of Public Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. Dr. Hetling's research interests focus on how public programs and policies can support economic well-being and financial stability among vulnerable populations, including families living in poverty and survivors of intimate partner violence. In 2019, Andrea was selected as one of only 5 Family Self-Sufficiency and Stability Research Network scholars and awarded a 5-year grant by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families. Before getting her PhD, Andrea worked as a program administrator at a domestic violence agency, focusing on advocacy and development issues. A strong believer in the public impact of applied policy research, Andrea regularly connects her research projects with her teaching and mentoring and her service to the greater community. Welcome, Andrea.
I should unmute myself. Thank you so much for that introduction. And now I need to also figure out how to share my screen. Share, let us see. Can everyone see that? I'm getting a nod, thank you. And I have it on my other screen. I want to see if I can push it over here and you'll let me know if for some reason it disappears. Again, my name is Andrea Hetling. I always feel the need when I enter into these spaces to say just a little bit more about sort of the work that I'm presenting before I go into this. So I want to acknowledge that my presentation draws heavily on my experiences, not only as an academic, but as a staff member at a local TV agency in New York City. And my presentation and everything that I say draws on collaborative applied projects. I very rarely work by my lonesome in my really nice office. I enjoy very much collaborating with others. I think that the research benefits from multiple voices at the table, multiple perspectives. I want to give a very big thank you to my colleague and friend, Hilary Botine, who's at Baruch College in New York and collaborated with me on the Home Safe Home book, and also to the Talcott Community Development Corporation right here in New Brunswick.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we're only seeing a sliver of your screen.
Oh, why, thank you. I'm wondering why. Does that change anything?
No, we're still,
I know it's going to change it. Does that change it?
Yes, we are now able to see it.
Okay, great. So now you all have to excuse me because now it's like my camera's on this screen and my slides are on that screen. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of this, but I think we can manage. Thank you for letting me know. So I'm going to move on and get my mouse to the right spot and we can still see my presentation. I'm starting with a little bit of Victoria's story. This was someone that Hillary and I had interviewed. She was living in the Bronx in New York and was discussing, she was currently residing in a housing program, but this was describing sort of her challenges before entering into the program. So Victoria explains that I was in a domestic violence shelter, hoping I would get the place. She had applied for a ton of different apartment buildings, low-income housing residences, but it was taking so long. I was getting frustrated. I was depressed. I was about to give up. It was very terrible. I was moving from borough to borough. It was hard for me to keep a job. And anytime I have to move to a new place, I have to adapt to the new place. I have to get a babysitter and change my child's school every 3 months. Victoria was sort of getting shoveled through the homeless shelter system in New York because she had used up sort of her allotted time at a few different DV shelters. We know, and it's wonderful to follow Kim's presentation because she kind of gave us a lot of the necessary background in terms of experiences with poverty. Domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness, particularly among women and children. There are multiple surveys and research projects that indicate it's the leading cause of homelessness among women and children. On top of that, the US has an affordable housing crisis for everyone. Low-income families often spend above 50% of their household income on rent and housing costs. Again, following Kim was great because many of the challenges that she described relate directly to the challenges in navigating the housing market. Applying for a rental unit necessitates documents, credit history, her point on evictions. There are also on top of that various rules and regulations once you become a tenant. Keeping the peace, if an abuser were to come in situations of stalking and the police were called, oftentimes it's the tenant that's blamed for those actions, regardless of whether or not that individual was at fault. So experiences of IPV, histories of intimate partner violence cause additional barriers to navigating what is already an inadequate and inaccessible housing market, particularly in the larger cities across the US. On top of all of this, experiences of poverty, experiences of intimate partner violence, experiences of homelessness are traumatic experiences, oftentimes that are interrelated and can occur over long periods of time. So all of these circumstances make the challenge of housing particularly difficult for survivors. At the same time, it's particularly important. Finding a long-term home is everyone's goal, right? We all need a safe place to be with our family. The diagram here is something Hillary and I put together after speaking with both advocates and survivors in our attempt to kind of describe the multiple pathways a survivor may need to navigate in order to find that long-term home. Sometimes, if one is lucky enough, your original home can become that. We'll talk a little bit about sort of efforts to ensure that survivors can remain in the home that they have, and that it's the abuser that leaves. But oftentimes, one is faced with moving to an emergency shelter. From there, particularly for low-income survivors, finding an affordable, decent rental unit in just 3 months' time, when you're also dealing with a number of other legal, emotional, child-related, other things, and getting your life back together. Oftentimes one will end up in transitional housing or another emergency shelter, whereas Kim described perhaps timing out and moving in with friends or couch serving or living in one's car, and all of these arrows sort of reflective of these multiple moves that someone like Victoria was describing and trying to manage. At the very end, we'd like to see someone in a safe, affordable, decent home, but getting there can be complicated. It doesn't help that there's a mismatch oftentimes between policy and the reality that families are facing. Emergency shelters are critical and a great success of the early DV movement, but they're often also very time limited. Funding constraints make them that. So limited to 30 or 90 days, and even with transitional or tier 2, most of those have pretty strict funding constraints and thus time limits as well. We know, however, the impact of trauma can be much more long-lasting. And when you add in struggles with poverty and access to resources, it's hard for me to imagine my almost adult children getting their lives together in 3 months. And they surely have many more privileges and access to resources than other survivors can. I already mentioned that there's also a crisis of affordable housing in the US, and landlords thus can be very demanding. When you have a number of people applying for your unit, you don't need to accept the first one or the one that you feel might present some risks. Someone with a history of eviction or a criminal background history. On top of this, in terms of income supports, public cash assistance often also has time limits and barriers, since many of those programs were not designed with the survivor's needs in mind. So in some of my work, I've also turned to advocates for insights, and we'll get to hopefully a more uplifting conversation about possible solutions. But this was one of the advocates that we spoke with, who was really frustrated. People are still leaving shelters in large numbers without having safe housing. And then, they tend to cycle through the system again. When people left the system, a lot of them were going to unstable living situations. So they were doubling up, tripling up with relatives, with people that they were acquainted with. A few people went directly into the general homeless system, and a number of people went back to the batterer. So it wasn't a great outcome. And if you spend a lot of money on shelter, you would like to see, at the end of the stay, people were in fact in a better situation, and that the kids were protected, and that there was at least a chance for improved life outcomes. So once again, this sort of very difficult choice that survivors can be faced with, well, do I sort of navigate the difficulties of living in poverty with a difficult housing market and very little public safety supports, or do I go back to my abuser? So now some of the better happy conversation. There are a lot of emerging approaches and various progress that's being made across the country in various agencies and advocacy groups, and I kind of characterize them in two different places. One as adapting and expanding existing sort of housing models, whether those are scattered site, like a housing first philosophy, helping people find apartments and giving them the supports they need, or more of a permanent supportive housing on site. But traditional housing models, but adapting those and expanding them to the needs of IPV survivors. And then there's another group of solutions where you sort of think of them as innovations in place. Working with public housing authorities, that there's a long waiting list to get a public housing unit. If someone needed to evacuate for their safety, maybe they shouldn't then go on the end of the list. Maybe they should be able to move to a different unit or transfer in some other way. So working within the existing sort of system, educating landlords on sort of understanding the needs of survivors and what's kind of reasonable rules and regulations, and ones that may be mismatched or have ill consequences.
3 minutes.
Thank you. So some of my work has focused more on the permanent supportive housing side of it, and looking at these models that allow residents, not just survivors. Permanent supportive housing is kind of a movement across various groups, and it operates on the assumption that individuals can make better life choices, handle things a lot easier if they have a stable home to go to. It was originally sort of put together more for individuals who were in need of certain medications, and it's a little easier to have access to all of those things if you have a stable home. And the model is supported by a number of studies that shows not just success of families, but actual cost savings. So if we're able to support people in a safe, stable home, that's actually a whole lot more efficient than emergency room stays and interactions with police, perhaps if you're sleeping in your car, or emergency shelter costs. There's a lot of balance, though, in kind of coming up with models, whether services are on site or off site. how accessible and how appropriate are those services if they're off-site? How do we balance independence and case management, sort of allowing flexibility and survivor choice, but also making sure that we're there to support them. And then a lot of buildings have struggled with kind of providing tenant support and teaching individuals the importance of paying rent on time and how to do all of this, but also then with building management and enforcing rules. So there's some competing priorities there, and a lot of unanswered questions that hopefully some of you can answer for me today. A lot of federal funding ties permanent supportive housing to some kind of disability. There are obviously many disadvantages in defining IPV as a disability, and how do we kind of navigate that space. Funders also want to know what are, how are people doing? What are those appropriate outcomes? Centering trauma-informed practices, even when we partner with outside organizations, and addressing diverse and sort of place-specific needs across the US has also been a topic of conversation. I also hate the word permanent. None of us have a permanent home. I have a really nice home. I'm hoping to be there for a while, but I'm not sure I'll be there when I'm 80. Like, permanent seems too much. Transitional doesn't really work either. I use the term long-term. I think I'm kind of alone in that, but I'd like to push others. I think semantics matter. In terms of our research and leaving with some fun or more uplifting quotes, the residents that we've been able to interview really appreciate the kind of dual support of a safe home that also offers trauma-informed services and supports. And we see a lot of success in their stories. And I thought my last page is references, not very exciting. I will stop my screen and thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing and for those words from survivors that you ended with, those positive affirmations of the work that's being done in the community. Our final presenter is Dr. Laura Johnson. She's an assistant professor at the School of Social Work at Temple University and holds a PhD and MSW in social work from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. Prior to joining Temple, she worked at the Center on Violence Against Women and Children at the Rutgers School of Social Work for over 8 years, where she served on their senior leadership team and conducted research and evaluation related to the prevention and intervention of violence against women. The goal of Dr. Johnson's research is to support the mental and physical health of survivors of interpersonal violence through the development and adaptation of measures and interventions. She is particularly interested in the association between survivors' economic security and their safety, as well as the economic empowerment of survivors. Welcome, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Does it look normal? Is it okay?
Yes.
So the name of my presentation is COVID-related financial hardship among survivors of intimate partner violence. And so I'm going to be focusing on one particular study today. I would like to thank the Rutgers Violence Against Women Research Consortium and the National Institute of Justice for supporting the project. And I'd also like to thank everyone for being here today and for the survivors who participated in this study. So fortunately, we have a great deal of background that has already been covered. So I'm primarily going to set the stage in terms of why I chose to focus on COVID-19 and financial hardship. You'll see in this study that I focus primarily on women identifying survivors. And I want to acknowledge that, research with male and non-binary survivors is also a critical area. My area in particular is interested in the intersections between women identifying experiences of hardship and how they intersect with other sort of broader inequalities that women identifying individuals experience. And so the COVID-19 pandemic represents a unique time in our modern history that will have long-term impacts for everyone, particularly survivors of intimate partner violence. Even prior to COVID, research has documented that women have been uniquely impacted by crises and natural disasters. And this has been found to be true with COVID as well. In general, women bear the larger burden of unpaid emotional labor within the home, such as things like caregiving responsibilities, and historically face greater lifetime wage penalties for these types of things. And they tend to make up the majority of the caregiver workforce in jobs like healthcare or domestic workers. Women are also more vulnerable to the psychological impacts of pandemic, some research suggests, and they experience increased incidences of intimate partner violence during this time. And so for this reason, it may take women longer to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Immediately after the COVID pandemic started, and since then, researchers have produced a great deal of scholarship documenting increased incidences and frequency and severity of IPV and increased financial hardship. And so some of this is not new or surprising. However, in this study, I chose to look at some very specific forms of the economic experiences that women identifying survivors experienced during COVID and some risk and protective factors with the long-term goal of exploring mechanisms associated with economic empowerment and resilience. And so as part of this study, the data was collected to include a range of economic hardships, both COVID specific and non-COVID specific, and as well as a range of protective factors, as I mentioned. What I'll be sharing today is some initial descriptive analyses that I've conducted so far. So this is all particularly new, specifically to look at the COVID-related financial hardships and some economic protective factors. So the data from this study was collected using the Qualtrics Research Panel service, which basically allows a researcher to contract with Qualtrics and they administer a survey to a targeted pool of survey respondents based on their existing panels. So the data was collected in July 2022, and as part of some of the questions that survivors received, it asked about their experiences with the COVID pandemic beginning approximately March 13th, 2020, which was the date in which it was declared a national emergency. To participate in the study, individuals had to be women identifying and age 18 or over, and they had to have screened positive for IPV. And so the screener used was called EHITS, which has 1 physical and 1 sexual abuse item, 3 psychological abuse items, and I also added 2 economic abuse and 1 stalking item to round it out a little bit more. So I worked with Qualtrics to designate quotas for income level and to some degree race ethnicity, although the income quotas were stricter. And so the survey began with informed consent, took approximately 25 minutes to complete, and survivors received approximately $20. I engaged in a range of safety strategies to try to protect the survivors in implementing the survey online, which I took out of this presentation because I was running close on time, I think, when I was preparing it, but I'd be happy to share those for those who are interested. So the 3 research questions guiding this presentation today are: to what extent did survivors in the sample experience COVID-related financial hardships? Did survivors' experiences with COVID-related financial hardships differ by income? And what economic factors were most associated with survivors' experiences with COVID-related financial hardship? So the COVID-related financial hardship measure was an index of 10 items that I created based on what was previously documented in the literature and what was anecdotally known about survivors' experiences during COVID. For intimate partner violence, I measured economic abuse, physical and psychological abuse through the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, and to limit the amount of questions that I asked survivors around violence for their own safety, I used the sexual violence item from the EHIT screening tool as to not ask again. And so for financial well-being, I looked at perceived instrumental support like social capital, economic self-efficacy, economic self-sufficiency, and financial knowledge. So for the analytic strategy, I did a power analysis, which showed that the sample size was adequate and there wasn't too much missingness across the data. It was only 7%. And so listwise deletion was used for the analysis. Descriptive statistics were presented on sample demographics, IPV experiences, and COVID financial hardship. I also look at group differences by income bracket, and then I use hierarchical linear regressions to look at associations between economic factors and COVID-related financial hardship. And the nice thing about this regression strategy is it allows us to look at the predictive power of these kind of series of items as I add them in. So in terms of sample characteristics, just generally, the average age was about 43 years old. Approximately 72% of the sample identified as white and 10% identified as Hispanic or Latinx. The majority were in a relationship and identified as straight. 40% had a high school degree or lower. Because of the income quotas, approximately 1/3 had incomes less than 30,000. A third had income between 30 and just under 60,000, and about a third had 60,000 or more. For this analysis, I broke it up into 4 categories so that I could look at it a little bit more incrementally. 37% of the sample was employed full-time, 15% were employed part-time, and 33% experienced employment status changes due to COVID, and that doesn't include things like planned retirements. In terms of their IPV experiences and COVID hardship, the IPV scales range from 1 to 5, with 1 being never, 5 being quite often. So the mean there kind of gives you a sense of where they landed. This was a community-based sample, which partly explains why it's a little bit lower. But the highest level experience was psychological abuse, followed by economic abuse, sexual abuse, and then physical abuse. 32% of the sample reported economic abuse-related financial debt. During COVID, IPV stayed the same for 70% of the sample, 22% experienced an increase, and 8% reported an decrease. And on average, participants reported experiencing about 3 COVID-related financial hardships. In terms of the group differences by sample characteristics, generally, in terms of sample demographics, the only significant differences across groups were education, full-time employment, and being in a relationship. And you'll see throughout the slides that cells with less than 10 people in them are suppressed using just a dash. In terms of IPV experiences, there were more group differences. So you'll see that there were statistically significant group differences for 3 of the 4 types of intimate partner violence: psychological, physical, and economic. Overall, across all 3, survivors with less than $30,000 or between $30,000 and $559,999 had higher means for IPV experiences. The majority of participants that indicated that IPV had stayed the same. However, a higher percentage of those less than 60,000 noted increased frequency. So the higher income brackets also had smaller numbers of participants though. This slide presents the 10 COVID-related financial hardships that I had asked survivors about in the survey. Some notable ones that I wanted to highlight are, with regard to the question, did you take money you put into savings out for, did you have to take out money you put into savings for other purposes out to meet your basic financial needs? And 57% of the sample said yes to that. Did you borrow money from a friend or family member to meet basic financial needs? To which 47% said yes. Did you need to apply for public assistance to meet your basic financial needs? 46% said yes. In addition, 34% indicated that they incurred significant credit card debt, and 16% reported that their partner stole their stimulus checks. Notably, only 3 of these differed by significantly differed by income level, and those 3 were being evicted for not paying rent or mortgage, borrowing money from family or friends to meet basic financial needs, and applying for public assistance. So for the regression model, this first slide presents, the model was ran all together to control for these various things, but I'm presenting each block at a time to show the different variables. So in terms of demographics, the only significant demographic characteristic associated with COVID-related financial hardship was age. And so as age increased, COVID-related financial hardships had like a small decrease. And you can see, so overall, this explains a very small amount of the variance in COVID-related financial hardships, only 6%. So this does not capture what's going on in terms of these hardships. And in the next block, I added intimate partner violence related factors. And these included abuse experiences, as well as economic abuse related financial debt and the increase in intimate partner violence. And so economic abuse was the only statistically significant form of IPV, and there was a positive relationship. Economic abuse related financial debt was also positively associated with COVID related financial hardship, and increased IPV frequency was positively associated as well. In block number 3, I added financial well-being indicators. I think most notably here, income was not statistically significantly related to financial hardship. However, survivors who reported changes in employment status did have increases. In addition, we had economic self-efficacy and economic self-sufficiency emerge as factors that were associated with decreased COVID financial hardship, which represent potentially an opportunity for future intervention or areas to strengthen. And so this one's sort of strange. Financial knowledge was associated with an increase in COVID-related financial hardship, but I think that's the nature of the questions that were asked to some degree. Doing things like selling off assets requires some degree of financial knowledge as it is. So that would kind of be my assessment of that. So overall, some key takeaways, actually, I'm going to skip that and go to the implications since that's more important. So in terms of research, like I said, this is very preliminary data from what I gathered. In the future, I'm interested in looking at sort of a broader range of economic and kind of more regular resilience factors that could be associated or protective of material hardship and COVID-related hardship. And the need to continue to look to survivors to better understand the long-term impacts of COVID and what they need as the world moves forward in this sort of semi-post-pandemic period. In terms of practice, we need to continue with the increased availability of economic interventions for survivors. And I know that a lot of this is limited by funding and staffing issues, but there are some more accessible and not costly resources that I just wanted to make note of, including von der Linde's model for economic advocacy, which integrates economic and consumer issues into IPV services, the All State Foundation's Moving Ahead curriculum, which Kim mentioned, as well as the Independence Project by the National Network to End Domestic Violence. And the links to those are going to be on the slides when they become available. And to continue to evaluate these interventions. And notably, economic empowerment interventions are important, but we also need, as Kim noted, services that provide tangible resources to really help fill these needs during these really difficult times, particularly when social capital might already be strained in their networks. And in terms of policy, in continuing to do this work, there's definitely a need for the continued movement towards funding availability, which fortunately, I think there's a rising recognition in this area of these associations. In addition, financial institutions like banks can increase awareness and strengthen their responses to IPV. While this is less common in the United States, in the UK and Australia, they have begun bolstering their responses, including by training frontline staff on signs of IPV, detecting patterns of abuse, and taking action in some cases. And that creates an area of opportunity that can be explored further. Also, really interestingly, in August, a federal consumer protection agency affirmed a credit law implemented in Maine, which was passed in 2019, which prohibits putting debt accrued due to economic exploitation appearing on survivor credit reports. And this was just bolstered by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which noted that states do have the authority to pass legislation protecting consumers. And so this sort of represents an innovative state policy that has the potential to support survivors.
time?
There are limitations to this study. They're on the slide. And thank you everyone for being here today. And like I said, there's some resources on the last slide, but they'll be available after when the PowerPoint slides become available.
Which I believe will be on the consortium website shortly. Is that, I think that's what I heard. So that's where folks can go to look for those.
Yeah. Slides will be updated in the way that you access this webinar. You'll be able to access slides there as well once they're available.
There you go. Thank you. And thank you to all of our presenters this afternoon, and to all of you who have participated in this webinar by attending and giving it your thought and attention. It's been a fabulous panel underscoring the necessity of considering economic justice in our work with survivors. So we're going to continue our conversation. And to that end, I'm going to share questions that are put in the question and answer box. If any of you attending have questions you would like our panelists to speak to, this is a chance to get their perspective and their perspectives. And I'm going to start with a question for Kim, which speaks to, I think, something that you mentioned and spoke to powerfully in your presentation about the fact that advocates are also deeply underpaid and that economic justice is an advocate issue too. So this participant says, as an advocate, I am also a victim of domestic violence and am striving to get back on my feet. At this time, I found no resources for financial means, and a history of abuse have interfered with funding even through the pandemic. What is a suggestion that you have to reach out and to be a help?
You'd think they'd be better at this by now. As far as like, the first thing I would suggest to anybody who's in a relationship where they're not safe is to just start squirreling away funds as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. And that's going to look different for everybody. Just like any type of safety planning, it's unique to that individual and the individual circumstances, both to the survivor and to the harm doer. And so I'd start with that. As far as actual resources, once you're trying to achieve safety, so creating that Go Fund, but then also create your own bank account, I would look at pull your credit report, know what your credit report is, do some things immediately to help improve your credit score and report. There are some things you can do, like reducing your risks, limiting the available credit that you have can also actually help improve your credit score. So there's some things you can do short-term short-term meaning like 6 months, that can be done to improve your credit score so that you have more options also for seeking safety potentially, as well as even broadening in some ways your employment opportunities, because some employers also require a good credit score, as well as even utilities and things like that. So those would be some things I'd recommend. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of just cash available. That's what we're hearing from survivors over and over again, is they just need access to cash. There's an amazing organization called Free From. They're like who I want to be when I grow up organization. And they do have some, and it fluctuates from time to time depending on the access they have to funds, but they have a direct assistance program for survivors. So you can go to freefrom.org, freefrom.org, and they have a direct assistance program that people can apply to. So that would be an option that I would suggest. And then there's also there are some like WISP, so wider opportunities for women. Women in Independence program, something like that. WISPinc.org is a scholarship program that's available to survivors and their children. It used to be Sunshine Lady Foundation, started by Warren Buffett's sister. So that's a scholarship opportunity that's available for both undergraduate and master's level assistance as well. Did that touch on any of it?
We also have a question in the chat here for states wishing to consider the new method of protecting the credit scores of survivors of IPV. Is there sample legislation available?
I guess I'm confused by the new method of protecting credit scores. I don't know what that means.
I think this might be a question for Dr. Johnson.
Okay, there we go.
So the legislation that was referenced is in Maine. I can see if I can drop the policy in the chat. The one thing that I would say about it is, like I said, it started in 2019. It has largely been hung up in litigation since that time. And so it's only very recently that they've kind of been able to move to a point where it seems to be supported. So I think in some ways what happens to it moving forward is sort of yet to be seen. However, I would say that the legislation that they have been able to put forth so far would be a good model for that. And I will see if I can find it to drop in.
Thank you. We also have a question in our Q&A that I think would be for any of you, but asking you to speak to what kinds of protective factors you see with survivors in terms of economic stability, resources, or well-being.
Well, I think I'll take the first go at this and then hand it off. But I think what's challenging about this is exactly what we tell people to think about when it comes to a healthy financial relationship is the exact opposite of what we tell survivors to do to get and stay safe. So, you know, in a healthy relationship, you share everything, you talk about everything, you don't hide money, you don't spend money secretively, and that's exactly the opposite of what we tell survivors. And so that can be kind of a challenge. You know, if you aren't able to talk openly about that home is not safe, and you go to couples therapy and your partner tells the therapist that you're hiding money, well, for good reason, right? And so I think those are some of the challenges sometimes to just keep an eye out for. The other thing I would just say to the helpers out there is to be willing to be part of that plan can be really helpful. I think when I used to do direct services, we never wanted to touch anybody's money. We never wanted to keep anybody's money. And, you know, like if money went missing, then they'd sue us with our high power attorneys, which never obviously happened. And so I think that advocates and programs need to rethink how they help survivors manage and maintain a GoFund. And so being really creative about that. The other thing I say is, we're just starting to get better about this, but looking at how things like PayPal and Venmo are being used by survivors, particularly in the gig and fintech economy, that if they're able to have any side hustle or extra income, storing that in their PayPal account, their Venmo accounts, or those kinds of cash apps, and stashing them there until needed. Many of those companies also allow for their own credit cards or debit cards. So just being really creative about how to manage that and being nimble in our advocacy.
I can add one other small point sort of from a housing perspective. In navigating sort of the housing market and rental space, women are more likely to be evicted than men. This is a sort of an eviction stat that's across, and more recent qualitative research indicates that this is because men are more comfortable asking for exceptions. When a woman gets an eviction notice, sort of, okay, I'm gone. And men will sort of push back a little bit more, ask the landlord for an extra month, ask for other things. So it's a very small sort of piece of advice, but I think it's a really important sort of skill, particularly survivors, is the ability to ask, and whether it's at your place of employment or with your landlord or through others, it doesn't necessarily even need to contain any kind of reasoning. Just, can I get an extra day? Can I have that extra month? And sometimes the answer is yes, even without a reason.
I just also remind people, just when talking about the connection between the housing and the protection piece as well, is just to remind folks that we've had survivors report that they were able to be tracked through their credit score and report. And so just reminding survivors that when they're applying for new housing or even a loan or opening a line of credit, And if it shows up on their credit score, if their harm doer knows enough about them to either poses them or has employment in a place where they could illegitimately pull their credit report, it will show where they're heading. And we've had survivors track down using credit reports solely.
Thank you all for sharing that. We don't have any other questions in the Q&A right now. But I would ask, and we have some people chiming in to say thank you. Since I know there are a lot of advocates on the call and we've mentioned it, what is happening in terms of economic justice for advocates too?
We're working on it. We actually have got some interest around just looking at how to, I actually run a domestic violence and economic justice advisor council, and we're taking on advocate fair pay this round. It'll just be a piece of paper. It's not, legislative by any means, but we're working on it. We certainly know it's an issue. We continue to put it out for funders to try to get a real handle on this. I actually just pulled some statistics last week saying on average domestic violence advocates make about $35,000 a year. And we know many advocates are also survivors. So it's certainly something I think we're paying attention to. It's something that I continue to talk about, and we're working on it is what I can tell you.
Thank you. We have some questions now coming in about all the technical assistance that's being provided. Is there a way to ask to suppress personal information in the credit report?
What was the question?
Is there a way to ask to suppress your personal information on your credit report?
No. Yeah. You can't. I mean, you're supposed to have to give permission for, like, if an employer wants to pull your credit score, you have to give them permission, and they should only have access to certain things. But if I'm posing, if I'm posing as my partner, then I'm going to see everything that I see, right? And so there's no way to suppress that necessarily. If you're not requesting an extension of line of credit and you are an employer or insurance or things like that, there's only certain things that they should be able to see. And that would not be one of them, where they're headed to and things like that, just like liens and bankruptcies and those kinds of things. So no, unfortunately.
5 minutes.
An additional comment, following up on the housing discussion, landlords also prey on women tenants and particularly on survivors. Women don't advocate for themselves as much, but they also get evicted for turning down landlord advances in this context. So thinking about some of the additional risks that survivors face when advocating for themselves.
Particularly for non-English speaking and non-native, yeah, it's a huge job.
Absolutely, thank you. And someone asking, are there any examples of economic justice or cash assistance approaches that specifically target young people or college students?
I mean, I'm not aware of any. I mean, Allstate Foundation did a little bit for college age folks with the sorority they worked with. I don't know how broadly it's been put out there, or it's been updated anytime recently. So I'm not aware of any that I can feel comfortable leaning on, putting out there.
Our university has a cash assistance program for survivors run through our advocacy office, but I don't know that there are broader efforts beyond individual university efforts.
I can say I haven't come across anything either, and I was somewhat recently looking in college literature about economic abuse.
Let's see, we have this question. We are currently in a disaster situations around the country in Florida and Puerto Rico. What can you ask an IPV survivor that isn't, are you safe, since no one is really safe during a disaster, to gauge whether they need help when they're also in the context of a disaster?
I would start with, are you safe from those in your home or who you reside with? And then I would follow it up with, what do you need to get safe? Whether that be you need help, you want to try to get them out, what do they need from that point forward? And I can just
We
say
have
that
several people thanking you.
on the, oh, great. On the loans that we've been giving out on the independence loans that we help do credit building on, we're waiving anybody that has been impacted by the recent hurricanes. We're waiving their payments for 3 months. And we did that also at the start of the COVID as well for everybody.
Well, I think with that, I don't see any more questions. We have a note in the chat about how to access your CEUs for those of you who purchased them. I would like to thank everyone for attending and our presenters for fabulous information and for this discussion this afternoon. Thank you all so much for your time and for your work with and on behalf of survivors.